Hey guys, welcome back. What do you get when you mix warm ale, questionable stew, a bard with 3 chords, and exactly 0 health regulations? Well, you get home. If you lived in medieval Europe, that is. Tonight, we're not just stepping into a building, we're stepping into a time machine that smells like wet wool and mystery meat. This is the medieval tavern. Rowdy, rickety, and somehow still more reliable than your last group chat. No glowing signs, no Yelp reviews, and no such thing as personal space. Just noise, heat, fermented chaos, and the occasional chicken under the table who may or may not be paying rent. So pull up a creaky bench, duck the low beams, and prepare to be surrounded by shouting strangers, smoke, spilled stew, and stories you definitely shouldn't believe, but absolutely want to. And hey, if you enjoy this strange little corner of sleepy history storytelling, do me a favour. Tap that like button and subscribe. But only if you mean it. We don't do half-hearted in here. That's how bar fights start. Now then, mind the ale puddle. Let's go in. It starts with mud. Not a polite, speckled sort of dirt, but thick, defiant sludge that clings to your boots like it's auditioning for a lifelong commitment. You've been walking for hours, maybe days, through winding lanes that smell like horse, compost, and a very specific type of wet that has somehow seeped through your cloak, your tunic, and possibly your soul. Then, finally, in the gloaming light, you see it. A crooked wooden shape leaning slightly left, like it's had one too many. This is not a palace. This is not a church. This is better. You've found the pub. The thatched roof droops like an old man's eyebrows, sagging under years of weather, smoke, and pigeon-related crimes. Its walls are wattle and daub. That is to say, they were built using the ancient and sacred technique of whatever we had lying around at the time. The windows, if you can call them that, are more holes than glass, plugged with greasy hide or cloth that probably started as curtains and slowly evolved into insulation. The door is oak, splintered, and bound with iron hinges thick enough to stop a battering ram. It groans as you open it, not with a squeak, but with a full theatrical lament, as if warning the rest of the room that someone new, and potentially sober, has entered. Inside, it's warmth. Not the crisp, fresh warmth of a sunny meadow, or a well-lit hearthside tea. No, this is the fuggy, lived-in warmth of damp cloaks steaming beside a fire, of bodies packed too close together, of soup smells and sweat, and someone who definitely stepped in something outside and brought it in. But it is, undeniably, a comfort. You've arrived. Here, in this chaotic, smoke-choked chamber, is the medieval community's beating heart. Forget town halls. This is where news spreads faster than disease, where disputes are settled with dice or fists, and where the beer is never cold, but always potent. It's a church with less shame and more shouting, a stage where everyone is both actor and audience, a place where, no matter who you are, you're just another traveller looking for firelight, a full mug, and hopefully, a place to sit that isn't cursed. There's no one kind of tavern. Step into a smoky pub in Yorkshire and you'll be greeted with a grunt, a nod, an ale that could strip paint. Head further south, and the inn might pretend to be more civilised. A candle on each table, a matron behind the bar who will gut you with a ladle if you touch her daughter. Cross into France, and the room hums with wine, scandal, and laughter that sounds like it knows your secrets. In Germanic regions, beer flows in ceramic jugs the size of your head, and someone is always singing about goats. Always. In a Norman roadside inn, the floor might be swept, the bread crusty instead of limp, and the innkeeper possibly able to count. In the Celtic corners, the singing starts earlier, and the brawls are more passionate than violent. There is variety, of course, but no matter the region, the ritual remains the same. You arrive, you enter, you're absorbed. Some towns boast grand inns, multi-roomed marvels of creaking staircases and draughty lofts, often run by the church or the guilds, meant for pilgrims and passing nobility. But the real spirit of medieval drinking lives in the alehouse. Smaller, filthier, louder. Often, the front room of someone's actual house, where the alewife brews in the back, stirs the pottage with one hand, and disciplines drunkards with the other. If she likes you, she might give you the good mug, the one without a crack. If not, you'll drink from the one that smells like cheese and remembers last Tuesday's argument. No two taverns are the same, but they all breathe with the same lungs. The crackle of a hearth that might be spitting more than fire. The scrape of boots across dirt floors, trying to find a dry patch that doesn't squish. The clunk of mugs, unevenly filled and unevenly clean. Laughter. Too much laughter. The kind that spills out the door and into the street, where it startles the horses and attracts the constables. There's no music yet, but someone hums. There's no dancing yet, but feet twitch beneath the table. There's no fight yet, but give it time. For now, you just soak it in. This space of noise and warmth and low expectations. It's a relief, really. Outside, the world is war, plague, taxes, and sermons. Inside, it's just stew and bad decisions. Inside, you matter only as much as your coin, your story, or your willingness to buy a round. This isn't your first time in a place like this. You've walked into alehouses with a plank over barrels pretending to be a bar. You've shared tables with men who snore louder than they speak, and whose elbows occupy diplomatic territories on both sides of their body. You've seen barmaids who could lift a barrel one-handed, and who wear their aprons like armour. You've eaten things from bowls that defy taxonomy. And somehow, you've always made it through. Even the way you walk inside is a ritual. Boots wiped hastily on whatever straw is underfoot, cloak adjusted, eyes squinting through the gloom. You spot a seat, you hesitate. Is that stew or blood on the bench? You decide you don't care. You sit. You're home. The tavern, whether in the rain-washed hills of England or the sun-drenched lanes of Provence, is more than shelter. It's a state of mind. It's a place where the noise drowns out the silence you carry from the road, where every mug tells a story, and every story somehow ends in laughter, a punch, or a marriage. Sometimes all three. And as your eyes adjust to the flickering shadows and your nose goes numb to the smell, you feel it. That subtle, unmistakable shift. You've joined something older than kingdoms, louder than churches, and more honest than courtrooms. You've stepped into the pub. Now, wipe your boots. You've made it through the door with your boots, dignity, and maybe your purse. But how did anyone even find this place in the first place? If you lived in the medieval world and you were thirsty, which is to say, if you were alive, finding a drink wasn't as simple as checking Google Maps or yelling at a glowing rectangle for directions. There were no neon signs, no phone books, and definitely no app with star ratings and phrases like quaint ambience or rustic charm. And yet, somehow, people always found the pub. Because when all else fails, follow the shouting, and the smell, always the smell. The first rule of locating a medieval alehouse is trust your senses. Your ears will guide you toward laughter, argument, or music played slightly off-key. Your nose will confirm your decision. Smoke, sour ale, something roasted, something suspicious. Your feet might get lost, but your instincts won't. Pubs announce their presence like drunk uncles at a wedding, loud, warm, and completely unconcerned with your schedule. Once you got closer, you'd spot the real sign. Not glowing, not printed, but hanging, swinging, or nailed up above the door. A crude wooden board, painted with a symbol you might or might not be sober enough to interpret. Was that a bear? A boar? A naked man with a stick? It didn't matter. You were there. And it was open. Signs were everything because most people couldn't read. But they could recognize shapes. That's why taverns hung symbols that were hard to mistake. Barrels, tankards, axes, moons, hounds, keys, and, quite often, Bushes. Yes, bushes. A simple green branch or bundle of leaves hanging over the door meant there's ale here. And if the branch looked a bit limp, it meant the ale probably did too. It wasn't just visual advertising, it was survival. In England, a sheaf of barley might hang beside the door. In France, a carved wooden grape cluster. In parts of Germany, a whole animal head would be mounted like a challenge. Come in. Drink. Try not to ask what the stew is made from. The symbols were loud, proud, and just subtle enough to stay on the right side of church disapproval. Mostly. Over time, the signs got fancier. Coats of arms, painted dragons, angels wielding mugs like flaming swords. But early on, it was whatever the landlord had the talent and time to paint. If he was good with a brush, you got the golden goose. If not, the sort of horse with wings, maybe. It worked. People remembered. Meet me at the White Boar, you'd say. And everyone knew which one. The one with the actual white boar nailed to it. Easy. The names stuck, even as the signs rotted and were repainted. Some names told you exactly what you were in for. The Drunken Friar. The One-Eyed Fox. The Leaky Barrel. Others were more cryptic. The Green Man, the Crooked Staff, or the Quiet Nun, which was neither quiet nor nun-friendly. Occasionally you'd find biblical references tossed in to keep the clergy appeased or confused. The Lamb and Flag, the Crown of Thorns, the Saint's Elbow. Most people didn't ask questions. They just went inside. Of course, not every drinking hole was lucky enough to have a swinging sign or a clever name. Many were simply known by the owner's name. Elfric's Ale, Matilda's Stew and Beds, Godwin's house, down the lane, smells like feet. You didn't need clever branding when you were the only building on the street that smelled like roasted onions and heartbreak. People would find you. And once they did, they'd try to figure out exactly where they were. Because not every place that served drink was the same. The words alehouse, tavern, and inn weren't interchangeable. They each had their quirks, and your night depended heavily on knowing the difference, assuming you were still sober enough to care. The alehouse was the most humble, and also the most dangerous. Usually, someone's front room, maybe with a barrel or two of something fermenting in the back. Run by an alewife, often the most terrifying and efficient person in a 10-mile radius. This place sold only ale. No wine, no beds, no menu, just a bench, a mug, and a look that said, "Spill anything and I'll bury you in the garden." Alehouses were where the locals drank, cursed, gossiped, and occasionally held an impromptu wrestling match in the straw. The tavern, by contrast, fancied itself more refined. These places served wine as well as ale, sometimes imported, always expensive. A tavern might have tables, a small kitchen, and the faint illusion of manners. Merchants, scribes, and men with too many rings on their fingers preferred taverns. You were slightly less likely to get mugged. Slightly. The wine was often watered, the food often foreign, and the regulars always had opinions about grain prices and city council. It was quieter, but not calmer. One poorly recited poem and you were liable to be heckled into next week. And then there was the inn, the hotel of the medieval world. If a tavern was for drinking, and a home was for sleeping, the inn tried to combine both with varying degrees of success. Inns were often built near crossroads or markets, offering lodging, meals, and stables for travellers. You might share a bed with 3 strangers and a dog. You might wake up to find your boots missing and your purse lighter. But at least you had a roof. Inns had names like the Pilgrim's Rest or the Red Ox. They served food that was warm, drinks that were room temperature, and service that was entirely dependent on the mood of the innkeeper and the size of your coin. Of course, the lines between all three blurred constantly. An alehouse might serve a bit of stew. A tavern might let you nap by the hearth. An inn might be indistinguishable from a barn with better marketing. What mattered wasn't the name, but the feeling when you stepped inside. Was the fire lit? Was the air thick with smoke and song? Were people arguing about pigs or politics? Good. You were in the right place. For travellers unfamiliar with a town, locating the right pub was both an art and a gamble. Locals would guide you, sometimes with words, often with gestures. Follow the road until you hear singing, they'd say. Or, turn left at the well, then right at the tree that looks like a man who owes you money. And remarkably, it worked. Somehow, inevitably, you'd find yourself at a door with a painted wolf or a faded sign of a boot and a mug. You'd push it open, duck your head, and step into that familiar fug of ale and humanity. What we now call branding, they called survival. A clear sign meant more customers. A clever name meant better memory. Some places even had chants or jingles, rhyming slogans shouted across markets or scrawled on walls. Drink deep at the goose, where your thirst meets its noose. It didn't have to make sense. It just had to rhyme. And if you couldn't read it, someone would shout it at you anyway. Eventually, authorities began to take notice. Not of the rhymes, but of the drinking. In England, by the 12th century, alehouses were required to display a sign if they sold drink. It was one of the earliest forms of consumer regulation. No sign, no license. Which sounds very modern, until you realise the sign could be literally a stick with leaves on it, and the license was issued by a man who couldn't read but really liked ale. Enforcement was inconsistent, but the tradition stuck. Even today, you can walk down an old British street and see echoes of those symbols: lions, roses, kings, boars, barrels, jugs. Their meaning has faded, their spelling modernised, but the message is the same. Come in, drink, laugh, maybe fight someone. Definitely regret it later. Because no matter what the sign said, what mattered was the space behind it. A space where stories began, friendships ended, songs were born, and memories got lost in the straw. A sign was just the opening line. The rest, well, that was up to you. So next time you pass a crooked wooden board with a faded goat painted badly on it, don't laugh. That goat might be the only reason someone in 1423 found the strength to keep walking through the rain. That goat might have meant home, or stew, or a story worth singing. And if you ever find yourself in a medieval town with no sign in sight, just stop, close your eyes, listen for shouting, sniff for onions, walk toward the chaos. You'll find it. You always do. Once you spotted the sign, or squinted until it looked like one, you stepped into a crowd louder than logic. Let's meet the glorious weirdos who made these places home. It's hard to say who walked in first. Maybe it was the knight, all dented pride and rust, still wearing a sword too long for the room, and a helmet that made him look like a disappointed kettle. Or maybe the monk, red-cheeked and humming a hymn about barley that suspiciously sounded like last night's drinking song. It could have been the farmer, boots caked in pig regret, eyes scanning the room like he'd misplaced his dignity somewhere near the hearth. But honestly, it doesn't matter. They're all here now, and the tavern has swallowed them whole. There's something beautiful about the clientele of a medieval pub. Not beautiful in the classical, paint me like one of your Florentine muses way, but in the way a soup of questionable origin is still, technically, food. This is a crowd curated by chaos. A living mural of scars, smells, and shouting. Step through the door, and you've entered a room where the social order sits down, takes off its shoes, and spills something on itself. Take the knight, for instance. He doesn't belong here. At least, not officially. He's a landowner, a man of arms, a banner carrier for some duke who hasn't paid him in 6 months. But tonight, he's traded his dignity for ale and his horse for a bench that creaks ominously under the weight of his chainmail, and regrets. He leans too far back, falls over exactly once, and is helped up by a man who makes shoes for goats. There is no judgment, only laughter and a round of something that tastes like if bread were angry. The monk sits across from him, hood back, tonsure glowing like a dinner plate under candlelight. He drinks faster than anyone else and insists it's all part of his spiritual process. The ale, he says, keeps the devil out of his thoughts and also out of his joints, his bowels, and his general outlook on life. He's very popular, this monk. He knows the good jokes, the good songs, and 2 verses of scripture that can be weaponized in an argument about pig taxes. At some point, he arm wrestles the knight and wins. No one is surprised, especially not the knight, who seems oddly relieved. The farmer, meanwhile, is 4 mugs deep and recounting the birth of a particularly stubborn calf, as if it were a battle epic. His hands mime things they absolutely shouldn't. He laughs before the punchlines and doesn't care if anyone else is listening. His cloak smells like wet hay and victory. He brought eggs to trade but forgot them under a table 2 drinks ago. The dog found them. The dog is now part of the story. Over by the wall, a mercenary leans with casual menace. Leather armour, scar across one eye, a sword that's seen too much, and a smile that hasn't. He doesn't talk much, but people don't sit too close. Except for one unfortunate merchant who thought he recognised him from a trade caravan. He did not. The merchant now drinks with exaggerated joy, hoping to live through the evening. The mercenary finally speaks. It's a joke. Everyone laughs. Tension evaporates. The merchant pees a little, but in this room, who can tell? And then there's the bard. There's always a bard. This one has a lute that's missing a string and a voice that isn't. His songs wander between tragedy and comedy, like a drunk on market day. He claims to have sung for kings. He claims a lot of things. Last night, he was betrothed to a duchess. Tonight, he's offering verses for stew. His boots don't match. His stories do. He sings of battles he didn't fight in and loves he never lost. People listen anyway, because in a place like this, truth is optional, but rhythm is mandatory. Somewhere in the corner, hooded and silent, sits the mystery. Every tavern has one. This one drinks slowly, eyes hidden, voice unheard. No one knows where he came from. Some say he's a fallen noble. Others think he's a fugitive. One man insists he's a wizard. Another swears he saw him steal a sausage without using his hands. No one approaches him, except the barmaid, who calls him Quiet One and brings him his drink without asking. She doesn't smile at him, but she doesn't charge him either. She's not scared. She just knows better than to ask questions before the 3rd mug. Then there are the others, the ones who fill the spaces between these main characters, like peas in a communal pottage. The old woman who drinks from her own flask and curses in 3 languages. The young man trying to impress someone, anyone, with a dagger trick he clearly just learned. The weaver who lost his wife, his business, and his sense of direction, in that order. The twins who speak in unison and claim to be one person with 2 bodies. No one believes them. No one argues either. This is the tavern. This is the alehouse. This is the inn. And this is its magic. Outside, society is a ladder. Inside, it's a bench. There is no table reserved for nobility. No sign that says, no peasants beyond this point. No velvet rope separating the goat herders from the heralds. Here, everyone is just another story waiting to be exaggerated. A mug waiting to be emptied. A name waiting to be forgotten. The public house is public in the truest sense. It belongs to whoever stumbles in, whoever can pay, or at least promise to. Lords sit beside labourers. Merchants dine across from mendicants. A carpenter might share a joke with a tax collector. A beggar might sleep beside a knight's squire. No one blinks. No one objects. Because once you're inside, you're just another part of the show. The mud on your boots doesn't care about your titles, and neither does the straw on the floor. And while the rules of the outside world are etched in stone, the tavern runs on different laws entirely. You speak when spoken to. You buy a round if you win a bet. You don't insult the cook unless you're faster than her ladle. You tip the barmaid, you respect the dog, and you never, under any circumstances, touch another man's tankard without permission. Fights might break out, but they're usually forgotten by morning. Friendships might form, but they rarely last past the next tavern. Still, for a few fleeting hours, every soul in the room is part of something holy in its chaos. Because that's the truth. No scroll or sermon will tell you. The tavern is a church with louder hymns and less guilt. It's the only place where confession doesn't require a booth, just an ale and a willing ear. It's where burdens are set down, laughter is picked up, and someone, somewhere, is always carving something into the table. So who let these people in? Everyone, and no one. The door is always open, the fire's always warm, and the company, well, the company is unforgettable, whether you like it or not. Now take a seat. You're one of them too. Now that you've locked eyes with a monk arguing with a mercenary, let's take a closer look at the actual building holding this circus together. Barely. If buildings could talk, the medieval tavern would mutter obscenities, cough twice, and fall over. Nothing about its structure suggests long-term survival. And yet there it is, still standing, barely. It leans like it's been whispering secrets to the wind for a century too long. The roof thatched and lopsided, the walls bulging out like the tavern's had a large meal and is too tired to suck it in anymore. It creaks when the wind blows. It creaks when it doesn't. But somehow, it holds. And inside is where the true magic happens. If you consider splinters, uneven flooring, and mysterious fluids magical, you begin at the door, which is never quite the same shape twice. It might be rounded, might be rectangular, but always just a bit too small for a confident entrance. Hinged with iron and swollen from rain and regret, it protests every time it opens. If it creaks, congratulations. You're in a good one. If it shrieks, run. Either the tavern is haunted, or the hinges haven't seen oil since the last coronation. You push your way through and duck, instinctively, because no beam in a medieval pub has ever met a ceiling it didn't want to sag from. The ceilings are low, alarmingly so. Whether this is due to original design or centuries of settling is unclear. What is clear is that if you're taller than average, you're going to develop a new relationship with the top of your skull. The beams are thick, dark, and usually just waiting for a distracted forehead. Some say the taverns were built that way to retain heat. Others say they were built that way because medieval architects were 5 feet tall and angry. The floor is dirt, not figuratively, not dirt-coloured, literal honest-to-goodness earth. Maybe there's straw scattered across it to soak up spills and sins. Maybe there's a thin layer of stone or wood in fancier places, the kind that squeaks even when no one's walking. But for most taverns, it's compacted soil mixed with ale dribble, stew splash, and several generations of footsteps. If you're lucky, it's flat. If not, the room may have a slight downhill slope, often toward the fireplace, as if daring fate to test medieval fireproofing. Speaking of the fireplace, it's more than a hearth. It's the tavern's heart, its lungs, and its permanent hazard. Built with rough stone and ancient soot, it burns too hot or not at all. It roars in the winter, smokes in the summer, and somehow always makes your eyes sting no matter where you sit. There's usually a cauldron hung above it, bubbling ominously, or else a spit with something roasting that may or may not be meat. It doubles as the kitchen, heating system, and smoke detector. Only one of those is theoretical. The walls are wattle and daub, twigs held together with a mix of mud, straw, and organic materials no one talks about. They're thick, but not soundproof. Every argument, every laugh, every off-key chorus of 3 drunken sisters leaks through them like ale through a cracked mug. If the tavern is stone, it's either a converted monastery or built by someone with money and questionable priorities. More often, the walls bulge slightly, lean left, or appear to be holding each other up through sheer peer pressure. Windows, if present, are an afterthought. Small, high up, and usually covered with horn, oiled parchment, or animal hide stretched thin and nailed in place. Glass is rare and reserved for buildings where people read or pray, neither of which happens here. As a result, most of the light comes from candles jammed into sconces, tallow lamps, and the occasional torch dangerously mounted at head height. The shadows dance. The smoke lingers. Everyone pretends it's atmospheric, not lung shrinking. Now look up. Not too quickly. You'll hit your head again. The roof is thatch, layered thick and meant to repel rain, birds, and common sense. It works, mostly, until it doesn't. A particularly spirited storm can knock loose entire sections, leading to the thrilling experience of drinking beneath an impromptu indoor waterfall. Rats live in the roof, so do spiders, and once in a Welsh village, a goat. No one knows how it got up there. It stayed for 3 weeks, became something of a mascot. And then there's the second floor. Calling it a floor is generous. It's a loft, a suggestion, a place where the boards stretch reluctantly over the common room below. You can hear every step, every moan, every curse shouted at the darkness when someone stubs their toe on the only solid object in the room. The stairs that lead up to it are narrow, steep, and aggressively splintered. If you reach the top without injury, you may sleep on a straw mattress that smells of sweat, smoke, and stories. If you don't reach the top, you sleep where you fall. That's tavern law. The furniture is as permanent as it is unstable. Tables are heavy, scarred, and carved with generations of initials, insults, and crude illustrations of things no anatomy book would confirm. Benches are long, low, and always on the verge of collapse. Chairs are rare and therefore sacred, usually reserved for the tavern keeper or the oldest, crankiest regular. Sit in one without permission, and you may find yourself airborne within seconds. This is known as a seating dispute. There are no winners. Behind the bar, if it exists, is a simple plank stretched over barrels, sagging under the weight of mugs, elbows, and economic despair. Shelves hold jugs of varying reliability, and under the counter is where secrets live, spare ladles, half-filled flasks, and the backup club for when diplomacy fails. There's a small hatch for passing things through, mostly stew, occasionally vengeance. The bar isn't just where drinks are served. It's the anchor in the chaos, the altar in this profane little chapel. Ventilation is a concept, not a feature. The smoke goes where it pleases. Some of it heads for the chimney. Most of it settles at head height and forms what scholars refer to as the ale fog. It burns your eyes, stains your cloak, and carries the smell of 20 meals and 3 arguments. On good nights, it's thick enough to blur out the parts of the room you'd rather not look at. On bad nights, it clears just in time for you to see the rat doing laps near the bread. And yet, somehow, this architectural disaster holds together, not because of design, not because of quality materials, but because of sheer, stubborn continuity. Each warped beam, each scorched corner, each nail bent by an apprentice who later became a goat farmer. Each piece has held fast, not through engineering, but through purpose. These places were built, not for beauty, or comfort, or even stability. They were built to hold people, to contain stories, to endure song, sorrow, spilled stew, and sword fights over borrowed spoons. The medieval tavern wasn't a building. It was a container, a vessel for humanity in all its glorious mess. Its architecture reflected its purpose, uneven, loud, chaotic, and absolutely alive. Designed not for elegance, but for evenings that began with a drink and ended with a story no one would quite tell the same way again. And if you ever doubt the strength of such a place, consider this. A castle falls when its walls are breached. A cathedral crumbles when its roof gives way. But a tavern? A tavern can burn to the ground and still reopen the next week in someone's barn with 3 mugs, 2 benches, and a fire in a soup pot. Because the real structure isn't wood or stone. It's noise, laughter, heat, chaos, carefully preserved and served warm. Welcome to the architecture of alcohol and bad decisions. You may want to duck. The walls may be crooked and the floor may be sentient, but the real medieval punch to the face comes from the smell. Let's inhale, together. Before you hear the laughter, before you taste the ale, before a bench tries to assassinate your shin with a rogue splinter, you smell it. The tavern doesn't announce itself with a sign or a fanfare. It arrives through your nostrils long before you touch the door. You're still half a street away when it hits you like a moist handshake from an invisible uncle. Sour, smoky, beefy, and deeply lived in. It is not a singular scent. It is a symphony of stink, a grand orchestration of medieval life conducted in the key of, "Dear God, what is that?" The top note, bright and immediate, is smoke. Not the polite kind you'd find wafting from a candlelit hearth or a roasted chestnut stall, but the heavy, throat-clutching smoke of wood too damp to burn clean. It coils around your hair, your cloak, your expectations. It never quite leaves. Even weeks later, someone will ask if you've been camping. You'll say no, but your coat will say otherwise. Just beneath that is sweat. Human sweat. Horse sweat. Possibly something mythical. This isn't gym sweat. This is the sweat of labour, layered day upon day, soaked into wool and leather, reheated by firelight and adrenaline. It's been fermented in tunics, caught in creases, and weaponized by body heat. The result is a kind of aromatic fog that could peel paint off the inside of your memory. Then there's ale, and, oh, does it make itself known? Stale ale, warm ale, ale that's been spilled, mopped up, spilled again, and now lives in the floorboards like a ghost with a drinking problem. It's sour, sharp, and oddly invigorating, like vinegar with dreams of grandeur. Some taverns even smell of hops and barley, if they're lucky enough to brew on site. Others smell like someone tried to brew ale in a boot and forgot it for a month. Both experiences are valid. Lurking just behind is onion. Not the crisp, raw bite of a salad ingredient, but the cooked down, slightly burnt, possibly ancient scent of onions that have been stewing since the last king's coronation. Onions were the backbone of medieval cuisine. If you don't smell onions in your tavern, you're either in the wrong century or the cook has finally lost her will to live. They cling to the air with a persistence unmatched even by sin. And then there's the truly dangerous layer. Meat. Not just meat, but meat. That is food that once may have been an animal, now reduced to a series of question marks and textures. The smell is rich, oily, and impossible to place. Is it rabbit, pigeon, rat? Something that was cooked with the fur still on? You will never know, and honestly, it's better that way. It adds to the mystery, and the mystery adds to the flavour. Now throw in wet wool, which is less of a smell and more of a life choice. Every cloak, every tunic, every sleeve, soaked by rain or sweat or spilled stew, contributes to the warm, slightly fungal scent of human outerwear. It smells like a barn that gave up, like a sheep who wanted to be a rug but wasn't finished yet. Combined with the ever-present tang of mud and the occasional whiff of fermented cabbage, the room becomes a scent museum, only everything's still alive and judging you. And yet, as you take it all in, something strange happens. You stop gagging. Your eyes stop watering. Your shoulders relax. The smell doesn't go away, but you adapt. The horror becomes homey, like a bad song you start to enjoy out of sheer exposure, or a relative who smells weird but hugs like they mean it. This stew of scents, this nasal battlefield, begins to feel oddly comforting, because no matter what you've stepped into, at least it's warm, at least it's real, at least it smells like people, messy, loud, absolutely unfiltered people. You begin to learn things through your nose. You can locate the hearth without ever opening your eyes. It smells of ash, singed bread, and something oily that's probably supposed to be soup. The corner near the door. That's where the wet cloaks hang, dripping their earthy notes into the already damp air. The bench near the back. That's the dog zone. You know because it smells like fur, bones, and justice. The table closest to the kitchen always smells the loudest. The mix of boiling pottage, sweating cook, and whatever that is roasting on the spit forms a hot, aromatic curtain. Meanwhile, near the bar, the smell becomes more human. Mouths, laughter, ale-soaked wood, and breath that could turn a mirror brown. The farther from the fire you go, the colder the smells get. Not literally, but emotionally. There's something colder about the far bench, where someone's sleeping under a cloak that was never washed. It smells like secrets, and possibly feet. Every smell tells a story. That sharp tang of vinegar? Someone spilled the pickled eggs again. The sudden breeze of floral sweetness? A noblewoman just walked in wearing something imported and expensive, instantly devoured by the musk of the room, like a single rose tossed into a midden heap. The sting of burned hair. Someone leaned too far over the hearth. Again. Sometimes the smells escape. They leak through cracks, through chimneys, through the open door when someone stumbles out for fresh air and ends up in a ditch. The tavern scent doesn't just stay in the tavern. It follows you, clings to your clothes, your hair, your memories. The next morning, long after the fire's died down and the stew has been scraped from the pot, you'll still carry the tavern in your lungs. You'll wake up with a tongue like a wooden plank, a stomach full of regret, and a cloak that smells exactly like last night, and the night before, and possibly the goat's birthday celebration from last week. And yet, this aromatic onslaught isn't just background noise, it's part of the fabric. It tells you you're alive, that you're among the living, the sweating, the drinking, the belching, the burned. You've left behind the sterile silence of the road, or the sharp coldness of the forest. You've entered the warm stench of humanity, and you belong here, whether you like it or not. The smell doesn't welcome you with grace. It assaults you, but it also holds you. It says, this is where stories ferment. This is where truth gets pickled, and courage smells like yeast. It doesn't need to be pleasant. It needs to be potent. And it is. So the next time you push open that heavy, iron-hinged door and step into the hot stew of medieval scent, don't flinch. Don't hold your breath. Breathe deep. Inhale history. Let the stink wrap around you like a second, much smellier cloak. Because in the tavern, the smell hits first. And once you've breathed it in, you're part of the story. Once your nose recovers, it's time to meet the one person keeping this mess from total collapse. And possibly the only human scarier than the stew, the tavern keeper. There is only one true ruler in the medieval world who needs no throne, no crown, and absolutely no patience. They wear no jewels, unless you count a crusted tankard hanging from their belt, and a ladle stained with 4 kinds of soup, and 1 documented felony. They do not command armies, unless you count 2 overworked children, 1 spouse with a limp, and a dog named Taxpayer. They are judge, jury, bartender, therapist, cook, and local deity. They are the tavern keeper. And you do not mess with the tavern keeper. Forget kings. The king isn't in here. The king doesn't know what it smells like when stew curdles over a fire that's also heating 3 boots and someone's underpants. The king doesn't mediate arguments about dice or pour ale with one hand, while hurling a barstool at a troublemaker with the other. No, the king rules on parchment. The tavern keeper rules on splinters and size. Your first impression depends on the mood, the hour, and the weather. Sometimes they greet you with a grunt, a nod, or a look that says, you break anything, you're paying in teeth. Others, they slap a mug in front of you before you sit, and you're expected to keep up or get out. Their faces are ledger. Their hands are calloused. Their eyes scan the room like a hawk monitoring drunk ferrets, The male keepers are usually barrel-shaped, not fat, not jolly, just compact and durable. Like a keg, grew arms and learned sarcasm. Their arms are as thick as fence posts. Their noses have been broken twice and realigned by ale fumes and willpower. They have seen things, fought things, cleaned things that should never have existed. If they laugh, the entire room checks the weather. If they frown, someone leaves. The women are worse. Not meaner, sharper, more precise. They rule with one eyebrow and 3 syllables. The apron isn't clothing, it's armour. Flour-dusted, ale-stained, and tied like a sash of quiet authority. A good female tavern keeper can silence a room without raising her voice. A great one doesn't even need to speak. She just reaches under the bar, and suddenly every man remembers he has manners, a wife, and fragile kneecaps. And yet, terrifying as they are, you trust them. You have to. They are the centre of gravity in a room spinning with chaos. The tavern keeper remembers what you owe, how drunk you are, who you insulted, and who's likely to come after you with a stool. They don't write things down. They don't need to. Their memory is perfect, and their grudges are eternal. They pour drinks, of course, but that's the least of it. They break up fights, not with gentle words, but with tankards, fists, and the occasional decorative sword pulled from a wall. They patch wounds, dispense stew, dispense life advice, and once, in Bruges, performed a baptism with ale. It didn't take, but the baby didn't cry, and that counts for something. Disputes are settled at the bar. Land deals, pig feuds, love triangles. Someone once confessed to a murder between mugs and was immediately handed a third. The keeper just said, "Well, better drink fast. They're on their way." No judgment, no surprise, just logistics. And they know everything. Who's cheating? Who's broke? Who's a runaway noble in a borrowed cloak? If you want news, don't go to the magistrate. Go to the bar. Slide a coin forward. Ask careful questions. Receive careful truths or lies flavoured with amusement. Either way, you'll get something worth repeating. And you'll owe them more than just money. They are also excellent tax evaders, not because they hate authority, though they do, but because they've been burned before. Tithes for the church, levies for the crown, fees for the guild. They pay when cornered, dodge when they can, and hide the rest under barrels, floorboards, and in plain sight. "This ale," they'll say, "a gift from my cousin." Their cousin lives 3 towns away and has been dead for 5 years. No one argues. No one wants to see the ladle again. They don't run a business. They run a battlefield. Each night, the tavern fills with people trying to forget, trying to remember, trying to steal or kiss or gamble, or just exist with a mug in their hand. And through it all, the keeper stands unblinking, cleaning a mug that will never get clean, stirring stew that should not be stirred, barking orders with the patience of a saint and the volume of a siege horn. Some keepers have help, a son who looks permanently tired, a daughter who can throw a mug with disturbing accuracy, a spouse who pretends not to hear most things unless they involve screaming or unpaid tabs, sometimes an orphan who never leaves and eventually gets promoted to floor mop that talks. They're a team, a tired, loud, soup-scented team, and they make the pub breathe. And then there are the legends. Berta of Eel Street, who once fought off 3 thieves with a spoon and a prayer. Big Tom from York, who kept a pet pig behind the bar named Credit and only served ale if you asked politely. Mother Edwin of the Black Goat, who once buried a baron's son in the cellar after he insulted her stew. The authorities never found the body, but they stopped asking questions after she served the magistrate a bowl of special meat pie and smiled too wide. The women, especially, held power like a tankard full of boiling mead. They weren't background. They were the pub. They brewed the ale, stirred the fire, negotiated prices, and enforced laws no one had written, but everyone obeyed. They didn't flirt. They didn't plead. They simply ruled. You wanted warmth? They gave it. You wanted trouble? They gave that too, with garnish. And heaven help the man who underestimated the woman stirring his soup. You didn't just know the keeper. You knew their stories. How they lost a toe to frostbite, how they survived the fire that took half the roof, how they once carried a passed-out knight 3 streets home and never let him forget it. They were myth and mortar. You could build a village around a tavern, but only if you had a keeper with fire behind the eyes and a club behind the bar. And when the tavern closed, if it ever did, they were the last to sleep. Long after the last drunk had been dragged out, after the benches had been wiped with a rag that should have been retired a decade ago, the keeper would sit alone by the dying hearth, a final mug in hand, a moment's silence. And then, as if by ritual, they'd look at the ledger, mutter something foul about prices, and prepare to do it all again tomorrow. Because that's what it means to keep a tavern. Not to own it, to keep it, to hold the fire, the drink, the laughter, the noise, to watch over the foolish and the desperate, to maintain order where no law dares tread. They are not saints, they are not heroes, they are tavern keepers, and they are the glue that holds the chaos together. Drink up, thank them, and for heaven's sake, don't ask if the stew is vegetarian. With the keeper glaring and the mugs flowing, it's time we talked about what's actually in those mugs. Spoiler, it's not always legal, safe, or fully liquid. Behind every raucous medieval tavern door, past the smoke, the stew, the man face down in a dice pile and the dog eating something unapproved, lies the true altar of the common folk, the bar. It's not fancy. A wooden plank on barrels, a few pegs, a rack of mugs that have never seen soap. But behind that bar is a collection of drinks so central to survival, culture, and collective poor decisions, it deserves a saga all its own. And that saga begins with ale. Always ale. Ale was life, and by life, we mean liquid bread with a tendency to backtalk. It wasn't some fizzy blonde pint you sip politely on a terrace in modernity. Medieval ale was thick, cloudy, and sometimes chunky. Unfiltered, unpasteurized, and stored in barrels with more mystery than cleanliness. It was closer to a porridge you drank than a beverage. Served lukewarm, poured with sloshy enthusiasm. It was drunk by everyone. Peasants, nobles, clergy, and most importantly, children. Yes, children. Because while ale might get you buzzed, water would get you dead. Let's be clear. Medieval water was not your friend. It flowed through streets filled with waste, corpses, and people who hadn't discovered soap. Rivers were open sewers. Wells were roulette wheels. Boiling took fuel. Ale, on the other hand, was boiled in the brewing process and fermented just enough to kill the worst of the invisible death. So children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Monks drank it like it was holy, which, to be fair, some monasteries claimed it was. And no one worried about the alcohol content because it wasn't about the buzz. It was about survival. Buzzing was just a bonus. Now, ale wasn't just ale. There were styles, regional flavours, preferences. Small ale for the lightweights or the sick. Strong ale for the brave or the foolish. Spiced ale if you had money and a desire to confuse your tongue. Most taverns brewed their own, usually in the back room, which doubled as a kitchen, storeroom, and home to at least one semi-retired rat. Brewing was the domain of the alewife. Yes, that was a real title. And she knew exactly how long to stir, when to add herbs, and which jug to hide from the taxman. The best alewives were terrifying, precise, and prone to shouting about mash temperatures while elbow-deep in barley. The process wasn't sterile. Malted grain was soaked, boiled, and fermented in vessels that may have once held fish, soup, or angry curses. Yeast came from the air, the wooden spoon, or divine intervention. Measurements were done by eye and instinct. If it bubbled too early, it was cursed. If it didn't bubble at all, it was worse. Once brewed, the ale went into barrels, wooden, leaky, seasoned with generations of spillage and barn air. It wasn't stored long. Ale didn't age well. It was brewed to be drunk, and quickly, before the flavour turned from earthy to why is it fizzing. Then there was mead, sweet, golden, mysterious. The drink of poets, nobles, and bees. It was honey wine, more or less, made by fermenting honey with water, and sometimes spices. Mead was smoother than ale, stronger too, and often considered a luxury. Not because honey was rare, though it wasn't cheap, but because good mead took time. Ale was ready in a week. Mead took months, which meant either you were patient, rich, or very bad at time management. When done well, mead tasted like sunshine and dreams. When done badly, it tasted like old candle wax soaked in regret. Some taverns served it as a novelty, others as a specialty. A bard might demand it as payment, a lord might offer it to a guest. A tavern keeper might hide a single dusty jug under the bar and pull it out only for weddings, deaths, or bribes. Cider was another common choice, especially in regions blessed with apples and boredom. Like ale, it was brewed fast and drank faster. It ranged from dry and sharp to cloudy and sticky, with occasional uninvited flavours depending on how the apples had been stored, or how long the barrel had been doubling as a footstool. Some taverns prided themselves on their cider. Others apologised for it mid-pour, but in autumn it flowed like rain. Wine was trickier. Good wine was for the rich. Imported wine was for the very rich. The average tavern might have a cask or two of something red, something white, and something labelled, "Don't ask." It was watered down, soured by travel, and stored in clay jugs that smelled suspiciously like garlic. But it carried prestige, and anyone holding a goblet of wine, yes, a goblet, because mugs were for ale and shame, instantly looked 12% more sophisticated, even if their boots said otherwise. And then there was water. Brave, reckless, raw water. Offered sometimes, consumed rarely, feared often. A tavern might draw water from a well, if they had one, or from a stream, if they were suicidal. Even if it looked clear, smelled fine, and tasted passable, it could still contain microscopic death, with names like dysentery and oops, your entire village died. If someone asked for water, the tavern keeper would raise an eyebrow and check to see if you had a will. Better to drink the ale. Always drink the ale. The drinks were served in vessels as varied and questionable as the clientele. Wooden mugs were the standard, heavy, slosh-resistant, stained with stories. Horns were popular too, if you liked drinking out of something that doubled as a weapon and couldn't stand upright. Metal cups, tin, pewter, occasionally iron, were for special guests, or stolen from someone wealthier. Clay jugs and goblets appeared in finer places, but they chipped like honour and broke like oaths. And no one had their own cup unless they were paranoid, noble, or recently robbed. Temperature wasn't a factor. Everything was room temperature, and the room was always the same, slightly too warm, heavily scented, and filled with air that tasted like it had once been soup. If a drink was cold, it was a miracle or a mistake. If it was hot, it had just boiled and would burn you in 5 languages. Refills came quick if you tipped, slow if you didn't, and instant if the tavern keeper liked the look of your coin or the sound of your silence. No menus, no flights of tastings. You drank what they had, how they had it, and if you asked too many questions, you got served the usual, which might be ale, or it might be something from the bucket behind the bar. Yet despite all this, or maybe because of it, the drinks mattered. They weren't just beverages, they were ritual, bonding, a way to survive, to celebrate, to forget. The first mug marked arrival. The second, conversation. The third, confession. The fourth? Well, that was where the regret started, and the singing usually followed. You didn't drink alone, even when you did. So next time you raise a modern pint, cold and clear, and delicately hoppy, remember where it started. In a smoky room, poured from a sticky barrel into a cup you hoped wasn't cursed. Remember that drinking wasn't always a choice. Sometimes it was the only safe option. And that behind every bar stood a keeper, a barrel, and a crowd of souls trying to drink the world a little quieter. And somewhere, in the foam of the ale, was history. Warm, thick, and slightly chewy. And once you've drunk something that may or may not fight back, your stomach starts asking tough questions. Let's explore the edible and inedible world of medieval food. Let's not pretend there was a menu. If you asked, "What's good tonight?" in a medieval tavern, the answer was usually, "It hasn't killed anyone yet." You didn't browse options. You didn't read specials scrawled in chalk. You walked in, sat down, and hoped what ended up in your bowl was warm, somewhat chewable, and didn't blink. Because the truth is simple and eternal. Medieval tavern food wasn't about delight. It was about survival with seasoning. At the centre of it all stood the culinary cornerstone of the working class, pottage. It wasn't a dish so much as a condition, a perpetual, evolving, bubbling stew that lived in a single pot and was only rarely cleaned. Pottage wasn't made fresh each day. It was a legacy meal, cooked on Monday and added to until Friday, a rolling boil of grains, vegetables, meat, on a good day, and history. You didn't ask what was in it. You asked how recently something new had been thrown in. If the answer was this morning, that was a good sign. If it was we think Wednesday, you ate quickly and prayed silently. The ingredients depended on what was lying around, what was cheap, and what was less dead than expected. Barley, oats, leeks, onions, turnips and beans showed up frequently, lending the pot a thick, vaguely beige consistency. Meat was an occasional visitor. Rabbit if you were lucky, chicken if someone got careless, pigeon if you were near a city. Sometimes you'd find bits of salted pork, and sometimes you'd find bones, sometimes both at once. Protein was precious. Protein was preserved. Protein was sometimes still crunchy. Herbs might appear if someone felt fancy, a splash of vinegar if they were pretending to care, a dash of stale ale if there was too much left in someone's mug. But make no mistake, pottage wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was trying to last. It was the edible version of a shrug. It said, "We tried. Here, eat." The sacred culinary triangle was this: grain, protein, and denial. Grain filled you up. Protein made you feel virtuous. Denial made the rest of it tolerable. You convinced yourself it tasted fine. You convinced yourself that chewy bit was just overcooked barley and definitely not tendon. You told yourself that green thing was a herb and not a mistake. This is how you got through it. Not by seasoning, but by suspension of disbelief. Bread was the tavern's sidekick, the backup plan, the vessel of last resort. But bread in the medieval world wasn't the fluffy, soft, forgiving loaf you tear into at dinner parties. No. Bread was a challenge. It was a dark, dense, sour, brick-like object forged from rye or barley and designed less to nourish and more to prove your jaw's resilience. If it was soft, it was fresh. If it was hard, it was last week's. If it broke your knife, it was celebrated as a miracle. Still, you ate it. You dipped it in stew to soften it. You scraped bowls with it. You lined your stomach with it and prayed it would hold back the ale. Some places even served trencher bread, flat, stale loaves used as edible plates. After a meal, they were either eaten, thrown to the poor, or fed to dogs depending on your mood, your manners, and how many guests had sneezed on it. Cutlery was mostly a BYO affair. Spoons were common, carved from wood or bone, sometimes stolen, rarely matching. Forks, however, were considered suspiciously foreign, even possibly heretical in some circles, a tool too dainty for honest food, and probably invented by people who didn't trust their fingers. Knives were essential, but you brought your own. Not for politeness, but because communal knives tended to disappear after fights. A good eating knife was sharp, personal, and useful in both food preparation and spontaneous conflict resolution. If you forgot your knife, you were stuck breaking bread with your hands, tearing meat with your teeth, and being quietly judged by everyone else. No one would lend you theirs. It wasn't rude, it was self-preservation. If you needed a fork, you used 2 fingers. If you needed grace, you went to church. Plates were rare, bowls were shared. A ladle of pottage might be sloshed into whatever was handy. A wooden bowl, a clay pot, sometimes a hollowed piece of bread, occasionally just directly into someone's hands if things got desperate. Mugs doubled as stew holders, hands doubled as napkins, tunics doubled as everything. And if you asked for something special, if you inquired, politely or otherwise, about vegetarian options or low-carb alternatives, the tavern keeper would look at you like you'd requested unicorn steak with a side of logic. The tavern didn't serve your preferences. It served what was hot and didn't scream. You could like it. You could not like it. Either way, the bowl was yours. There were variations, of course. In coastal towns, you might find fish, smoked, pickled, dried, or recently confused. In forested areas, game meats appeared more often, ranging from noble venison to dubious badger. In wealthier establishments, you might find pies, heavy, meat-filled, and crusted with a dough that functioned more as armour than pastry. Spices were rare, treasured, and used with the enthusiasm of someone sprinkling gold. Pepper was worth a ransom. Cinnamon was a legend. Eggs, if served, were boiled beyond recognition or floated in something sulphuric. Cheese was common, but terrifying, ranging from creamy and fresh to sentient and adventurous. Pickled vegetables existed. No one liked them, but they added colour. Fruit appeared only in season, and mostly in desserts nobody could afford. Dessert, incidentally, was just more bread with honey if you were lucky, and fermented sadness if you weren't. Despite all this, or maybe because of it, people still filled the taverns. They still sat down, groaned, and waited for the stew. Because eating wasn't just sustenance. It was ritual. It was shared misery. It was laughter between grimaces and familiarity in the chewing. You didn't eat for joy. You ate for survival, for warmth, for the illusion of control in a world that could take your livestock, your teeth, and your roof with equal indifference. And somehow, through all of it, it worked. The pottage filled you. The bread scraped your ribs clean. The knife reminded you not to anger the man beside you. The stew wasn't always good, but it was always there. And in the smoke and din and clatter of mugs, something in your stomach shifted. Not satisfaction exactly, but something close. Fullness, warmth, hope's cheaper cousin. You learned to love it, not the taste, but the act, the ladling, the slurping, the wiping of your chin with a sleeve that already smelled like 3 meals and a horse. You came to associate the stew with safety, the bread with belonging, the hard crunch of overboiled beans with the sound of stories around fire. So you swallowed. You smiled. You leaned over your bowl, dipped your crust, and said what everyone always said before a medieval meal. Not bon appetit, but a resigned, hopeful grunt that translated roughly to, well, here goes. Full of stew and unasked-for mystery meat, what's left to do but gamble away your dignity and possibly your boots? Welcome to the dice-stained side of tavern life. There's a moment in every medieval tavern night, somewhere between the 3rd mug and the 4th confession, where the room tilts slightly, not from the architecture, though that never helps, but from the shift in mood. The stew's gone lukewarm. The bard's playing the same 3 chords. Someone's passed out in the corner. That's when it begins. The scrape of a bench, the slap of a hand on the table, the glint of bone-white dice spilling across a scarred plank like prophecy with a drinking problem. Gambling time. Tavern gambling wasn't organised. It wasn't polite. It certainly wasn't legal, though the law had long since stopped entering taverns unless it was very drunk or very lonely. What it was, however, was ritual. It was the heartbeat of late-night ale culture. A chaotic ballet of coins, curses, and men who absolutely believed they were just one throw away from fortune or eternal humiliation. Dice were the currency of fools and the glue of friendship. They came carved from bone, wood, ivory, stone. Whatever could be shaped, marked, and thrown across a tabletop that hadn't been wiped since last harvest. The rules varied. Some games were about adding, others subtracting. Some games made no mathematical sense at all and existed purely to encourage shouting and losing one's dignity in front of a sympathetic barmaid. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone rolled, someone groaned, and someone else cackled like a victorious gremlin. The stakes were as flexible as the rules. You could bet a coin. You could bet your mug. You could bet your shoes, your cloak, your bed for the night, your honour, your name, your goat. Some bet livestock they didn't own, children they forgot they had, or spouses who weren't consulted. A man once bet his shadow. He lost, and no one saw him again in daylight. That's the sort of story that gets told with a wink and half a tankard, because everyone knows it's a lie, but everyone still wants to believe it happened 3 towns over. Cards were less common, more expensive, and often missing a few crucial pieces. Decks were hand-painted, inconsistent, and filthy. A full set was a luxury. Most were cobbled together from tavern to tavern, like cursed relics of poor decision-making. Card games were slower than dice, but more personal. You had to think, bluff, stare a man down, while pretending your hand wasn't composed of duplicates and one card that was clearly part of a religious text. It wasn't poker. It wasn't anything, really. But if you played it confidently enough, people assumed you were winning. Then there were side games, the kind born of boredom, mead, and escalating dares. Thumb wrestling, arm wrestling. Who can chug the fastest without vomiting on the dog? 2-man stare contests that ended in nosebleeds and laughter. Someone once challenged another man to a who can hold the hot coal longer contest. The winner got a free round. The loser got a nickname and a lifelong fear of fireplaces. Cheating was not a possibility. It was a certainty. If you weren't cheating, you were losing. Loaded dice were passed off as heirlooms. Cards were tucked into sleeves with all the subtlety of a street juggler on fire. Coughs signalled bets. Winks meant someone was watching. A foot under the table could nudge a result just far enough to tilt fate and earn you enough coin for another round of ale, or enough trouble to get your nose introduced to the floor. But everyone cheated. That was the game. The trick wasn't to avoid cheating. The trick was to cheat just enough that no one noticed, or at least not enough to make a fuss. If you were caught, you laughed, bought a round, apologised with a wink, and prayed no one brought out the blunt end of a tankard. There were unspoken rules. You didn't cheat the tavern keeper. You didn't cheat a man twice in one night. And you never, ever cheated a drunk nun with knuckle tattoos. She didn't bluff. She hexed. Sometimes gambling got serious. Voices rose. Fists clenched. A blade got touched, never drawn, unless someone was feeling particularly dramatic. Then a crowd would lean in. The air would thicken. Someone would clear their throat. And just like that, someone would throw a coin, crack a joke, or fall off their bench and fart loud enough to reset the mood. Balance restored. Bets resumed. The social hierarchy vanished during games. A lord and a stable boy could both lose their last copper to a toothless fisherman named Rollo, who smelled like regret and fish oil. You didn't need status to win. You needed luck, lies, and enough confidence to pretend your 666 roll was a sign of divine favour and not a deeply suspicious coincidence. Gambling was democracy with dice. And it was beautiful. Losers had no dignity, but they had stories. No one remembered the man who won 3 rounds and went home richer. Everyone remembered the farmer who bet his trousers, lost, and had to walk home wrapped in a tapestry stolen from the tavern wall. Everyone remembered the bard who bet a song and delivered one so obscene the tavern roof leaked with shame. The real victory was in the aftermath, in the chorus of laughter, the shared stew, the sympathy mug offered by someone just as broke and just as happy to be warm, fed, and not in debt to the local moneylender with the oddly sharp smile. And sometimes, gambling created miracles. A drunk soldier lost a silver ring and gained a wife. A baker lost all his flour money and ended up inventing a bread and ale casserole that would haunt the region for generations. One man won a pig, brought it home, and became a local hero after it defeated a tax collector in single combat. Again, probably a lie. But probably not. The tavern itself played a role. Tables were chosen carefully. The one near the hearth was too hot. The one by the door too draughty. The best was in the middle, visible, loud, and close enough to the bar that you could order another round without shouting over someone's theory about dice spirits. The keeper sometimes played. Usually not, but they watched, always, and if things got too heated, a mug would hit the table with just enough force to remind everyone whose floor they were standing on. In this world of shifting fortunes and ale-stained ambition, everyone gambled. Even the ones who claimed not to. You gambled when you drank the stew. You gambled when you kissed the barmaid. You gambled when you sat too close to the man with the scar and the twitch. Life was chance. Games just made it louder. And as the night stretched, as the candles drooped and the smoke thickened, the dice rolled on. Coins clinked. Cards were dealt. Bets made. Shoes lost. Pride shredded. Laughter echoed through rafters, shaped by 1,000 similar nights. And somewhere in the corner, a hooded stranger smirked as he rolled another perfect 6, again, and no one quite dared ask why. That was the beauty of it. That was the danger. In the medieval tavern, everything was up for grabs, even your pants. And when your coins are gone but your ego's still intact, you turn to stories and songs, meet the bards, the ballads, and the lies that kept the night going. There's always a bard. Somewhere in the tavern's shifting noise, nestled between spilled stew and whispered wagers, there sits a figure, half in shadow and fully in performance mode. His cloak's too long, his eyes too bright. His instrument, usually a lute with one string clearly doing its own thing, is always slightly out of tune, and his voice isn't so much good as it is committed. But none of that matters, because in a medieval tavern, the bard isn't background noise. He's the playlist, the gossip column, and the local history museum, all in one tunic. Tavern music wasn't polished, it wasn't planned. It was spontaneous, chaotic, and always too loud or just loud enough. The bard didn't wait for silence. He created it, demanded it, shattered it. His songs ranged from heartbreaking ballads of lost love, sung with all the emotional finesse of a goat in mourning, to drinking chants so catchy they infected the room like musical dysentery. You never asked for a bard's set list. You endured it, and you usually ended up singing along. These were no ordinary musicians. Bards were part performance artist, part court jester, part unreliable historian. They came from towns with names no one remembered, carrying stories they mostly made up. They weren't welcome in churches, rarely in castles, and never in silence. But in taverns, they were sacred. A bard with a song could turn a quiet night into legend. And a bard with too much mead could clear a room faster than a flaming pig. Their job wasn't just to sing, it was to stir. They stirred hearts with tales of heroes who spoke in rhymes and wielded swords like metaphors. They stirred guts with tales of noble feasts and dreadful betrayals. They stirred trouble with songs that mentioned local lords a little too cheekily, a little too often. until someone recognized their own wife in the second verse. And then they stirred the air with the unmistakable sound of someone being chased out with a mug and a mop. Minstrels were the more professional cousins, trained, refined, often hired by courts or festivals. They played harps, flutes, psalteries, and occasionally something called a hurdy-gurdy, which sounded like a barrel organ having a personal crisis. Minstrels knew chords, scales, etiquette. Bards knew how to survive on tips and charm. Scolds, on the other hand, were a whole different flavour. Scolds told stories with teeth. They didn't sing. They declared. Often in rhyme. Often drunk. Sometimes terrifyingly accurate. They could recite entire lineages, recount ancient battles, or insult someone's haircut in verse. No one liked to scold. Everyone listened anyway. Songs weren't written down. They travelled by ear, bouncing from one tavern to the next, picking up new verses, dropping old ones, changing names and motives, until a simple tale of a shepherd's heartbreak turned into a 35-stanza epic involving dragons, betrayal, and a suspiciously French-sounding goat. Bards didn't care. Truth was optional. Entertainment was everything. If the rhyme was good, and the chorus repeated well after 6 ales, it was a hit. The oral tradition didn't just live in these places, it fermented in them. Taverns were where stories came to breathe, to grow, to mutate into something grander. You didn't learn history from books. You learned it from the man who claimed to have fought beside the king, and whose missing toe was supposedly a souvenir. You learned it from the old woman who sang lullabies about real wars and fake lovers. You learned it from the bard, who sang of queens, quests, and unholy chickens. The stories were alive, sometimes more than the audience. Even the instruments had character. The lute was the favourite, portable, dramatic, and surprisingly durable in a bar fight. Drums were communal. If the bard didn't bring one, someone would find a table, a boot, or a passed-out friend's back. Flutes were rare but piercing. Fiddles showed up in higher-end places, or when someone had recently robbed a merchant. And then there was the voice, strained, shouted, staggered through syllables like a donkey trying poetry. Bards didn't sing well, but they sang loud, and that's what mattered. Every region had its hits. In England, songs about lost battles and found sheep. In France, sultry ballads with suspicious timelines. In Germany, drinking songs that started patriotic and ended somewhere between philosophical and unprintable. There were tales about saints, sinners, royal affairs, magical apples, cursed mirrors, and one extremely popular tune about a man who married a mermaid and couldn't swim. It was a banger. Sometimes the bard would pause, sip their ale, often donated, occasionally stolen, and slide into a story. Not a song, a story. Spoken, not sung. Delivered with theatrical pauses and wide eyes. These tales were where myths were born. A knight with a flaming sword, a witch who cursed ale to taste like tears, a beast in the woods that spoke only in riddles and always asked for your name first. The stories weren't real, except maybe, just a little bit. People believed what they wanted to believe. That's the magic of the tavern. If a tale was told well enough, often enough, drunk enough, it became truth. Someone would swear they saw it. Someone else would nod solemnly and add a detail. And just like that, history was made, lubricated by ale and sealed in song. Of course, not all bards were welcome. Some sang off key, some sang off colour, some didn't sing at all, just mumbled poetry until the stew started to boil in sympathy. These were the ones who didn't last, the ones who got a mug to the head or a gentle suggestion to try a different profession, like swamp fishing or silent contemplation. But the good ones, the real ones, they ruled the room. For one night, maybe 2, they were legends. They walked into the tavern hungry, half-frozen, unknown. They left full, paid in stew and stories, and remembered just enough to be invited back. So next time you imagine a medieval tavern, Don't forget the bard. Look past the drunk monks, the arguing farmers, the stew that's legally a biohazard. In the corner, there's a figure tuning a battered lute with a smile that says they've seen too much and remember just enough to make it entertaining. Their song is about to start. It'll be about love, war, or livestock. You won't know all the words, but you'll be humming it by morning. Because long before the printing press, before books were bound or ink flowed freely, there was the bard, half liar, half legend, full heart, giving voice to the stories we were all too sober to remember properly. And maybe that's the point. But music isn't the only thing heating up by firelight. Now comes the flirting, the wooing, and the occasional romance involving turnips and regret. If you've ever witnessed a man try to woo someone with the words, "Your face is less sweaty than usual tonight," congratulations. You've already caught the spirit of medieval flirting. In a tavern world where personal hygiene was optional, privacy was theoretical, and romance was best timed between stew servings, the concept of courtship didn't so much evolve as it staggered in drunk, grinned with 2 teeth, and offered to hold your mug. There was no such thing as subtlety. Romance in the medieval pub was loud, immediate, and often met with suspicion or outright laughter. If you made eye contact across the ale-drenched table, that was already a proposal. If you smiled, you were halfway to marriage or mortal peril. And if you shared your bread crust, well, someone get the bard, because that was the stuff of sonnets and scandal. The tavern wasn't built for love, and yet love kept showing up, usually limping. It reeked of smoke, desperation, and onions. But somehow, amid all that noise and nonsense, people still connected. Maybe it was the mead. Maybe it was the lack of other options. Or maybe, just maybe, there's something deeply romantic about finding someone whose mud-covered boots accidentally stomped on your foot, and who then apologised by offering half their pottage and a very confused wink. The process went something like this. Step 1. Approach with confidence. Confidence in this case meaning leaning slightly less than usual and attempting to stand still without the support of a bench. Step 2. Compliment. These ranged from, "Your hair looks recently unlice-ridden," to, "Has anyone told you your elbows are shaped like nobility?" Step 3. Offer drink. Not purchase. Offer. You slid a mug toward them and hoped it was still mostly full. If they accepted, congratulations. You were now in a relationship until one of you passed out or was dragged away by friends who'd seen this disaster before. For those with coin and fewer scruples, taverns were also places of transaction. Prostitution was both common and complicated. It wasn't legal exactly, but it wasn't illegal enough to stop anyone. Women, and sometimes men, worked the room with a glance, a joke, a brush of the arm that said, "Yes, this is a business, but no, I don't do stew questions until after." They knew the rhythms of the room better than anyone. Who had coin, who had charm, who had neither but might still be worth 5 minutes in the back room and a lesson in overconfidence. These workers weren't to be trifled with. They were smart, fast, and armed with sharp tongues and sometimes sharper blades. They could charm a knight, humiliate a monk, and spot a pickpocket mid-pick. The tavern keeper usually turned a blind eye, unless things got rowdy or someone forgot to pay, in which case the whole place suddenly remembered the rules again, and the death stare behind the bar did the rest. Courting, for those looking for something less transactional and more doomed, was a longer game. A baker's son might sit beside a weaver's daughter, both pretending they weren't staring. A merchant might try his luck with a brewer's apprentice. A pilgrim might lock eyes with someone over a bowl of lentils and decide fate was involved. It never was. But fate didn't serve ale, and so imagination filled in the gaps. The tavern allowed for that magic. Amid the shouting and farting and badly played music, there were corners. There were stolen moments, a shared joke, a hand touched by accident and not withdrawn too quickly. Love wasn't announced. It just sort of happened. Slowly, stupidly, sometimes wonderfully. And then there were the regulars, The flirts who thought they were clever, the ones with 3 lines, 1 shirt, and no shame. They'd try their luck every night, rotating through compliments like dice. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't, but they kept trying. Because rejection in a tavern wasn't final, it was just Tuesday. And next time, maybe the light would be lower. Maybe the ale would be stronger. Maybe your hair would look more poetic. Gender dynamics were murky and more flexible than you'd think. Sure, the world was patriarchal. Sure, women had fewer rights, fewer options, and the ever-present risk of being married off to a man who thought bathing was for heretics. But in the tavern, things tilted. Women could own the space, serve the drinks, make the jokes, swing the ladle, choose who sat beside them and who got told, in no uncertain terms, to sit elsewhere unless they wanted their mead to taste suspiciously like regret. Romance was messy, always. But in the tavern, it was honest. You met someone as they were, tired, sweaty, loud, and human. There were no polished shoes, no perfumed letters, no moonlit serenades, unless the bard was particularly desperate. Just 2 people and a shared bowl, and the understanding that for one night, at least, you weren't alone. Maybe you danced, if you were brave, and the floor wasn't too sticky. Maybe you kissed, if you were brave and their breath wasn't too sticky. Maybe you didn't speak at all, just sat together, heads leaning closer, as the hearth crackled and the world felt briefly less cruel. Some of these romances became marriages. Some became regrets. Some became children with untraceable birthdays and suspiciously strong lungs. But all of them became stories. Stories told over fresh mugs and old laughs. Remember the girl who poured stew on that night's lap? Remember the farmer who tried to serenade the barmaid and ended up serenading the goat? Remember when I met your mother in this very room, and she told me my hair looked like I'd lost a bet with a hedge? These were the love stories of the common folk, born not in ballrooms but in benches, forged not through lineage and legacy, but through spilled drinks and shared jokes, and the simple courage of looking someone in the eye and saying, "So, you come here often?" And sometimes that was enough. Of course, for every flirt that went wrong, a fight wasn't far behind. Let's dive into the rowdy, ridiculous, and surprisingly rule-bound world of medieval bar brawls. It always starts with something small, a spilled drink, a misplaced elbow, a misheard insult that may or may not have involved someone's mother, sister, or suspiciously handsome goat. 1 second you're sipping ale, dodging stew drips, and leaning in to hear the bard absolutely butcher a love ballad, and the next, the room is a whirlwind of shouting, shoving, and a flying bread loaf no one's quite sure was intentional. Welcome to the bar fight, the unofficial halftime show of the medieval tavern. You might think fights in medieval taverns were rare. Drunken outbursts, regrettable evenings, avoidable incidents. No, they were expected, even encouraged in that slightly unspoken, culturally sanctioned way that everyone pretended they weren't. A tavern without at least 1 decent scrap a week was probably cursed, haunted, or worse, boring. The patrons knew this. The tavern keeper definitely knew this. Even the dog curled under the bench lifted its head when voices rose, ears twitching like a seasoned fight promoter. The anatomy of a tavern fight is simple and surprisingly poetic. First, the spark. Small, dumb, and often ale-related. Someone leans too far into a conversation. Someone loses a bet and tries to take it personally. Someone reaches for the last hunk of communal bread and finds themselves holding hands with a stranger who takes their carbohydrates very seriously. There's a beat, a pause, the breath before the symphony. Then comes the first shove. Rarely effective, always dramatic. Tankards slosh. A chair scrapes. A shout echoes, "Oi!" Or, "That's my pig." Or, "Say that again and I'll bless your teeth out your mouth." It doesn't matter what the words are. The tone is what sets everything off. A tone soaked in alcohol, pride, and just enough theatre to get the crowd's attention. Because a tavern fight isn't just a brawl, it's performance art. The choreography is interpretive. There's a lot of swinging and missing, a fair bit of grappling. People fall over more often than they land punches, and when they do land one, it usually knocks over something else, which starts another fight entirely. You'll see grown men tangled in cloaks, noble lads trying to slap with gloves, and one guy who clearly thinks he's in a sword duel despite holding a spoon. Every surface becomes part of the scene. Benches are shields, tankards become clubs. A roast chicken in the right hands is a missile of surprising accuracy. Weapons, in theory, are discouraged. Nobody wants a stabbing. A bar fight is meant to be noisy, embarrassing, and only occasionally bloody. Pulling a blade escalates things from hilarious brawl to this tavern is now closed for 3 days and haunted. That said, sticks, stools, and the occasional leg of mutton are all fair game. So is the old trip and fall into someone strategy, which often works better than expected, especially on the slippery, beer-slick floors that make every step an invitation to join gravity's dance. There's always a crowd. They don't join in, at first. They shout advice, cheer like it's a joust, and nudge the nearest friend. Informal betting begins instantly. 2 coppers on the blacksmith. 5 says the bard runs. 1 ale on the big one, until he slips on the stew. It's not organised, but it is enthusiastic. And somewhere in the back, the tavern keeper is counting mugs and muttering prayers to gods of woodwork and patience. The tavern keeper doesn't break up a fight immediately. That would be rude. You wait. Let it burn a little. Let some pride be bruised, a couple mugs be broken, and at least one table be redefined as a horizontal seating solution. Then, when it starts to get too serious, when someone picks up a candlestick or starts quoting battle poetry, that's when the keeper intervenes. Not with words, with presence. A slammed tankard, a thrown ladle, a look so sharp it could slice bread. And just like that, the chaos slows. Fights in taverns rarely last long. They erupt, they wobble, they burn hot and fast like a stew left too close to the fire. And then, as suddenly as they began, they end. Someone laughs. Someone claps. Someone helps the fallen farmer off the floor and hands him a mug like nothing happened. There are no hard feelings, only hard stools. The moment resets, the tension dissolves, and the bard starts playing again. This time a jaunty tune everyone pretends they don't know the lyrics to. This wasn't random violence. It was a ritual of release. A burst of collective steam. An accidental group therapy session with splinters and shouting. You weren't fighting because you hated the man. You were fighting because winter was long, stew was short, and sometimes a man just needed to wrestle someone into a bench to feel alive. Honour culture had its place, but so did ale-fueled catharsis. And strangely, these fights often led to friendship. 2 men who'd never spoken before might wake up under the same table and share a laugh over bruises. You broke my nose. You stole my shoe. We should do this again next Tuesday. It was bizarrely bonding. Blood was minimal. Ale was flowing, and no one held grudges, except the goat. The goat never forgot. Of course, not all brawls were accidental. Some were planned. Quiet feuds that escalated with each round until someone nudged a shoulder 1 time too many. Those fights were heavier, slower, often ended with someone being escorted out sideways. But even then, there was form, structure, a kind of unspoken agreement that this was the place to settle things. Not the church, not the fields. Here, between the benches, under the cracked beam and beside the hearth. And yes, women fought too. Never underestimate a barmaid with a ladle or a widow with a grudge and a heavy boot. They fought smarter, faster, and usually ended things before the men had even stopped flexing. If you saw a woman stand in the middle of a brawl and just raise one eyebrow, you left the room. If she rolled up her sleeves, you left the village. So much of tavern life was about letting the pressure out, through song, through drink, through dice. And sometimes, through a full-body dive into the man who just called your brother a sack of spoiled onions. These weren't noble battles. They were honest ones. Real, raw, ridiculous. And despite what your sore ribs and missing belt might tell you, deeply communal. You might leave with a limp. You might leave without your dignity. But you'd also leave knowing exactly who had your back when the tankards flew. Because in the medieval tavern, fighting wasn't just allowed. It was tradition. A sloppy, glorious, ever-repeating ballet of ale, ego, and airborne furniture. And if you were lucky, by the end of the night, someone would buy you a drink for your troubles, possibly even the person who punched you. After the final punch and one last round, you'll need to sleep, assuming the stairs don't kill you first. Let's talk lodging, lice, and deeply questionable rest. Booking a room in a medieval inn was less like reserving a suite and more like entering a sleeping lottery, where the prize was possibly a bed, probably a cough, and definitely at least two strangers who snored in harmony like badly tuned bagpipes. Lodging wasn't about comfort. It was about not dying outside. That was it. No one asked about thread count. No one demanded fresh towels. They were just happy to find a spot where they wouldn't be rained on, stabbed, or licked awake by a curious pig. Getting a room meant climbing a staircase that looked like it had strong feelings about your continued existence. The wood groaned, warped, and occasionally splintered in protest. If you made it up without slipping or being hit by a descending drunkard, you were doing better than most. The second floor, and anything above that, if you were rich or reckless, wasn't built to code, because there wasn't one. The floors tilted, the walls bowed, the windows either didn't close or didn't open. You accepted it, because the only other option was the stable, which smelled like optimism compared to what waited upstairs. Rooms varied. In theory, you could pay for private lodgings. In practice, that meant you had a door, maybe a wall, and only one other person instead of 5. Most rooms were shared, and the bed was a straw-filled sack that had been beaten into shape so many times it was more memory than mattress. You didn't ask what was in it. You didn't shake it. You just lay down, prayed your skin didn't itch too soon, and hoped the groaning wasn't the floor preparing to collapse, or the man next to you entering his final chapter. Straw was the great equalizer. It poked lords and peasants alike. Mattresses were communal troughs of sleepless regret, and linens were things you heard about in stories. If you were lucky, there was a blanket. If you were very lucky, it was dry. Pillows were for royalty, or people who brought their own sack of rags. Everyone else learned to use their boots, their arms, or their travelling companion's back as neck support. No one emerged from sleep refreshed. They emerged defeated, damp, and deeply introspective. Pricing was flexible, depending on your purse, your charm, and whether the innkeeper thought you looked like the type to start a fire or die mid-sentence. A private room, which again meant a slightly more structurally stable closet, could cost a silver or more. Shared space was cheaper. Floor space was even less. The cheapest option? Find a spot and try not to bleed on anything. Some inns offered packages: stew, ale, sleep. Others operated on the ancient and sacred system of bartering, coin, chores, or storytelling, depending on your skill set and how desperate the innkeeper was for entertainment or floor sweeping. Who could stay depended on local law, the innkeeper's mood, and how convincingly you lied about your profession. Merchants were welcomed. They had coin and gossip. Pilgrims were tolerated. Piety meant they probably wouldn't steal anything. Minstrels were a gamble, useful for business, terrible for sleep. Soldiers, if sober, were allowed in pairs. If drunk, they were turned away unless they were charming, in which case they were given the room above the stables and a strongly worded warning. Women could stay, but alone, it raised eyebrows. Accompanied, it raised more. And if you were a monk or nun, you were either shown to a quiet room or immediately asked to bless something weird. And then came the creatures. Not wolves or bandits, although they were always a possibility. No, the real threats were smaller. Mice, for starters. They lived in the walls, the floors, and sometimes in the mattress with you. You didn't scream. You negotiated. They were less pests and more roommates. Some had names. Some stole your food. One became famous for stealing a bishop's sock and starting a minor theological panic. Then there were the lice, the tiny, relentless reminders that no matter how noble your blood or expensive your boots, you were still just another walking buffet. Delousing wasn't a thing. Scratching was. And once the itching started, the whole room joined in, a chorus of cursed sleep and mumbled regrets. Fleas weren't far behind. Neither were spiders. Neither, occasionally, were ghosts. Yes, ghost stories were part of the package. Every inn had at least one. A phantom knight in the attic, a weeping maiden in the washroom, a spectral pig that vanished when you looked at it directly. Most were tales to scare newcomers and entertain the regulars, but a few guests did leave suddenly. And a few rooms were always just a little colder than the others. And when you woke up and your shoes were 6 inches to the left and slightly warm, you chose not to ask why. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, people still came, still stayed, still paid, because the medieval tavern room, for all its flaws, was a haven. It was dryish, it was indoors, it had walls, it had, sometimes, companionship. You could share a bed with a travelling friar, a grizzled merchant, and a woman with one eye and a knife for a necklace. And somehow, that was safer than sleeping alone in the woods with just your fears and a poorly trained goat. No one slept well. No one slept deeply. But they slept. And in a world where comfort was a luxury and survival was the bar, that was enough. You woke with a sore back, an unfamiliar smell on your cloak, and a vague memory of someone singing lullabies in a language you didn't recognize. You checked your coin pouch. Still there, mostly. You checked your boots. One had a new hole. You checked your bedmates. One was gone. One was drooling. And one was almost definitely pretending to be asleep to avoid conversation. And as the sun broke through the warped window slats, slicing the room into lines of dust and hope, you stretched, groaned, and whispered the words that every tavern guest eventually learns to live by. Next time, I'm sleeping in the stable. And what follows a bad night's sleep? A worse morning, hangovers, hard bread, and one very judgmental chicken. This is your medieval wake-up call. There is no sound quite like a medieval tavern waking up. It's not a bell, or birdsong, or the cheerful clatter of breakfast being prepared. No, it's a low collective groan, like a choir of the damned tuning up. It rises from the floorboards, seeps from beneath benches, and escapes through cracked windows like stale hope. It is the anthem of 100 sore heads, stiff backs, and profoundly confused bladders. Welcome to the morning after, where hangovers are medieval, and so is everything else. The fire has burned down to an apologetic heap of ash. The air smells of wet wood, regret, and someone's feet. You open one eye. It's crusty. You open the other. Mistake. A rooster crows somewhere too close to your brain. You sit up. Mistake again. Your spine makes a noise like 2 pieces of wood divorcing under duress. Your mouth is a desert lined with old stew. Your tongue may be made of wool. You are alive, technically. You glance around. There's a boot near your face. Not yours. There's a man curled up on your cloak. Definitely not yours. There's also a chicken, balanced delicately on your chest like it owns you, which, based on your current level of agency, it probably does. It hops off with a dismissive cluck, leaving behind a perfect chicken foot imprint on your cheek. You now wear poultry as a brand. You rise, slowly, like a haunted marionette. The tavern is a battlefield. Only the swords were tankards, and the casualties were self-inflicted. Spilled ale is now a sticky map across the floor. Tables are slightly more horizontal than you remember. A bench is upside down, no one's sure how or why. Someone is snoring under the bar. Someone else is halfway up the stairs, frozen mid-climb like a sculpture titled Ambition Meets Ale. And then there's the tavern keeper, already awake, already sweeping, already judging you silently with a look that says, "I've seen worse, but not by much." They move like a storm cloud with a broom, gathering debris, straightening chairs, and reheating something in a pot that smells both edible and vaguely accusatory. This is their domain, and they know exactly who spilled what, who owes who, and who is currently lying to themselves about never drinking again. Breakfast, and we use that word with some creative generosity, is served. It's pottage. Again. Still. Possibly forever. The same pot as last night, now with a crust around the edge and a layer of mystery across the top. It's thicker, meaner, more philosophical. You spoon it up with a stick or a borrowed knife, or your fingers if you've given up entirely. It tastes like history and heat and someone else's turnip. There's bread. Technically, it's hard enough to require strategy, but it soaks up ale and shame equally well. If you're lucky, there's a bit of cheese from last week. If you're very lucky, it's still cheese and not trying to evolve. You dunk, chew, contemplate your life choices. No one talks much. Talking hurts. One by one, the tavern's temporary residents begin to reassemble themselves. Someone dunks their head in a bucket outside and screams. Someone finds their belt hanging from the chandelier and silently accepts this as a metaphor. Someone else finds their dignity in a corner and gently kicks it further under a bench. No one knows what happened after the third round. No one wants to know. Memory is a fragile thing, and medieval ale doesn't so much preserve it as bludgeon it repeatedly with a ladle. Conversations happen in grunts, nods, the occasional muttered phrase like, "Still got both boots?" Or, "Was that stew or was that stew?" Names are not exchanged. They are remembered vaguely and incorrectly, if at all. You are the one who sang, or the one with the goat, or the one who lost the dice game in his pants. It's fine. Identity is fluid when everyone smells like damp wool and existential confusion. Some patrons leave early. They shuffle out into the morning light like survivors of something slightly biblical. They blink, stretch, sigh, and head back to lives that require sobriety and shovels. Others linger. They sip from leftover mugs, try to reconstruct their nights from witness testimony, and quietly ask the tavern keeper if anyone left behind a pouch, a lute, or a small but unusually aggressive chicken. Clean-up is ritual. Spilled ale is mopped. Ashes are shovelled. Tables are righted. Chairs are fixed with twine, hope, and denial. The hearth is restoked. The air slowly shifts from acrid fog to something resembling breathable. And through it all, the tavern keeper moves, sweeping up bones, bread crusts, coins, and the occasional unconscious patron who politely gets rolled to the side until they're ready to function again. Eavesdropping is the morning's entertainment. Someone whispers about a fight that almost happened. Someone else corrects them, saying it did happen and also involved 2 pigs and a misquoted prayer. The bard, somehow still present, is tuning their lute and preparing to rewrite everything that occurred into a song that will rhyme stew with you and be wildly inaccurate in the best possible way. This is how legends are born, from half memories and whole hangovers. The comfort of it all is surprising. The routine, the warmth, the shared silence. Everyone is recovering, rehydrating, regretting, together. There's something deeply human about it, about waking up in a room full of strangers who all made the same mistake at slightly different speeds and are now united in their mutual desire for shade, soup, and silence. This is community. A deeply inefficient, slightly damp, thoroughly chaotic community. But it works. By midday, the tavern resets. The floor is cleanish. The stew pot is topped up with new optimism. The tables are set. The keeper nods. And already someone is walking in, road-weary, muddy, hopeful, asking if there's room for one, maybe two, and if the ale is still good. It is. It's terrible, but it's there. And the day begins again. But even with the headache and the stew flashbacks, something beautiful lingers. Because the medieval tavern wasn't just a place. It was an entire world. You didn't go to a medieval tavern for the drinks. Not really. You went for everything else. The noise, the stories, the gossip, the heat. The chance that tonight might be the night the bard remembers all the lyrics, or someone finally punches that one guy who always boasts about his turnips. The ale was warm, the food was questionable, the seats were damp, and the smell was an ancient crime scene. And yet the tavern was the one place where life felt more alive. Because more than just a drinking hole, the tavern was a time machine, one that ran on fermented grain and collective delusion. It was the beating, burping heart of the town. A proto-town hall, courtroom, therapy centre, daycare, courtroom again, and once more, drinking den, all in one building that leaned to the left and occasionally leaked rain directly onto your stew. News travelled here faster than a royal courier, and twice as twisted. You didn't need parchment when you had pipe smoke and speculation. The bishop's nephew eloped with a fishmonger's daughter. The miller's cow talks. The king's going bald. Truth was optional. Delivery was everything. If the man saying it had one eye and three teeth, you knew he meant business. The tavern was where politics happened. Deals were made, schemes were whispered, taxes were cursed. If a lord wanted to know what the people thought, he sent a spy to the tavern. If a rebel wanted to start a movement, he stood near the hearth and started buying rounds. If a merchant wanted to survive, he listened. This wasn't democracy. It was democratic chaos, and everyone got a turn at shouting. It was also a court, unofficial, unrobed, unhinged. Disputes over chickens, fences, and stolen boots were settled here, usually by shouting, occasionally by thumb wrestling. You didn't bring your problems to the magistrate. You brought them to the man with the mug who knew who cheated at dice last week and who owed who a favour. Justice in the tavern wasn't blind. It was loud, slightly drunk, and surprisingly fair, as long as you didn't mind being judged by a pig farmer and two guys named Jeff. Confession also happened here, though no priest was involved. Just ale, time, and that one friend who listened with the patience of a saint and the memory of a turnip. I shouldn't have married her. I shouldn't have sold the mule. I think my goose is cursed. Secrets spilled as freely as ale. Regrets were passed hand to hand with the mugs. The tavern didn't solve your problems, but it made them funnier, and sometimes that was enough. And then there was the performance. Always. Even without a bard, someone was telling a tale, reenacting a brawl, doing impressions of the local tax collector with terrifying accuracy. Every table was a stage, every bench an audience. The tavern was where oral tradition didn't just survive, it danced. Myths were born between mugs, legends shaped in stew, and every farmer who once saw a glowing bird or talked to a saint got his night of fame, however briefly, before being challenged to a drinking contest by a nun who'd had enough of his nonsense. It was messy, it was loud, it was sticky, but it was home, not to individuals, to communities. Rich men drank beside the poor, pilgrims shared stew with pickpockets. A knight and a widow might argue about bread crusts and then toast to each other over burnt onions. Class lines blurred here, at least until the bill came. The tavern didn't care who you were outside. Inside, you were just another soul seeking warmth, noise, and possibly a spot near the fire that didn't reek of socks and boiled cabbage. Over time, the medieval tavern changed. The thatched roofs were replaced. The fire hazards decreased. Eventually, things like health codes and furniture that didn't scream when you sat down appeared. Taverns evolved into inns, alehouses, and finally, the pubs we know today. Cleaner, brighter, marginally quieter, and somehow always playing music from 2007. But something of that medieval soul still lingers, like the ghost of an unpaid bar tab. Look closely the next time you walk into a pub. Not a chain with 14 TVs and a cocktail menu longer than a night's resume. A real pub. Wooden beams, a bar that's seen things. A regular named Stan, who claims he once arm wrestled a ghost. That place. You'll see it. The echoes of the past. The bartender who knows your name and your ex's birthday. The table in the corner where someone's always arguing about nothing. The board with local gossip tacked up beside the specials. That's the tavern, still breathing, just wearing a cleaner shirt. We still crave what the medieval tavern offered. Connection, chaos, catharsis. A place to be a little less polished, a little more human. Somewhere you can hear a bad joke, tell a worse one, and leave feeling more yourself than when you arrived. We don't call it oral tradition anymore. We call it pub banter. But it's the same instinct, to share, to perform, to belong. Straws gone. So are the shared beds, the lice, and thankfully the communal stew. But the heartbeat remains. In every laugh that turns into a song, in every argument about things no one will remember in the morning, in every raised glass, clinked gently, and every new face welcomed with a nod and an, "Oi, you're sitting in Jeff's spot, but he's passed out, so never mind." The tavern is still here. Not in architecture, in us. In our need to gather, to unwind, to shout a little and listen more. In our need for stories, badly told. For drinks, poorly poured. For strangers who, 2 ales in, become temporary best friends. So here's to the tavern. Time machine, theatre, battleground, sanctuary. May its mugs be full, its benches sturdy, and its stew only mildly threatening. Because whatever century you're in, there's always room for one more. Just mind the chicken. And so, weary traveller, we've made it to the end of our journey. Boots muddied, hair singed, and with at least 3 stories we'll never admit to in daylight. Medieval taverns weren't just places to eat, drink, and dodge flying stools. They were messy, magical time machines, where the world cracked open just wide enough to laugh, shout, flirt, fight, cry, and sometimes, just sometimes, fall asleep on a chicken. Thanks for watching. If this medieval madness made you grin or groan, mission accomplished. Drop a comment, maybe what you'd do in a tavern, or just say, "I nap like a knight." More dusty scrolls and dicey songs on the left. May your ale stay cold, your goat stay gone, and your luck hold at the dice table. Cheers. See you in the next one.